The people in our history books, they didn't build the modern world. All they did was inherit it. At least that's the claim at the center of the Tartaria rabbit hole. The theory, it says that there was once an advanced civilization that covered a massive portion of the earth. Its cities were filled with enormous domes, huge towers, and machines that pulled energy straight out of the air. Then something terrible happened. The cities they were buried, the technology was stripped away. Then the survivors disappeared, and you have some that believe that thousands of children were loaded onto a train, given to new families, and scattered all across the country. And the civilization that built everything, it was erased from history. And the name behind all of this is Tartaria. Now, look, guys, I'm not telling you all that happened. That's for you to decide. But the crazy thing is, those maps are real, those orphan trains are real, and those huge, magnificent buildings, they're real. Up until a shocking number of them were destroyed. You see, guys, the argument begins when you place all those pieces beside one another. And then you have to ask, what kind of story does all of this tell? Because if the Tartaria theory is even close to the truth, then we're not living in the civilization that built the modern world. We're actually the replacement population living inside its ruins. And somebody taught us to call all those ruins our own. So the question tonight is, was there another civilization that advanced? And if so, why do they want to keep us from that advancement? As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and I want you to remember your truth depends on where you're standing. And that, my friends, is relative perspective. Okay, guys, before we go any deeper, I'd like to explain to you what Tartaria really is. Because if you're anything like my mom was when she asked me what my topic this week was going to be, and I told her it was going to be Tartaria, she basically looked at me and she said, "What the hell is Tartaria?" Well, Mom, here you go. Tartaria, it actually has two meanings. Historically, Tartary, it was a name that a lot of European map makers they used for this huge swath of land in northern Asia. And some claim that they didn't understand this area very well at the time. Now, depending on the map and the map maker, it covered parts of Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia, and Manchuria. Now, look, I want you to understand something. Those maps, they're real. Now, historians, they'll tell you that the word describes a broad region, and it was filled with different peoples and kingdoms. The thing is, it was not one unified empire, kind of like America is today. But there's another Tartaria that people talk about online, and they claim that it is a very, very different place. Some say that it was an advanced civilization, and its reach may have extended far beyond Asia. They say that Tartarians built many of the grand courthouses, cathedrals, train stations, capitol buildings, and exhibition palaces that we now credit to the 19th century. Then they said a huge catastrophe had buried all those cities. Then they removed all the technology. And for whatever reason, they said that they rewrote history. You have different believers that argue over almost every single detail of this story. But all the theories, they all share one suspicion. They say that the world that we inherited, it doesn't match the history that we were given. And the first crack in that history, its name is printed across old maps, and those maps are from all over the world. Okay, guys, in 1570, you had a Flemish mapmaker named Abraham Ortelius, and this guy, he published one of the most important atlases of the early modern world. And inside that atlas was a map titled Tartaria, or otherwise known as the Kingdom of the Great Khan. Not Khan, C-O-N, it's Khan, Khan. And like I said before, this name, it stretched across a huge section of Asia. Now, in later maps, you saw this same area, it was divided into different regions. First, you had the Russian Tartary, then you had Chinese Tartary, Western Tartary, Independent Tartary, and last but not least, Little Tartary. Not only that, in 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, it also described Tartary as a vast country all across Asia. Now, look, guys, I want you to imagine that you found that. You're scrolling through old maps late one night for whatever reason, and there it is. You see it. This huge, enormous place that covered a huge chunk of the world. And it had a name that you were never ever taught in school. Then you look at other maps and you find it again and again. These are maps through different years, different map makers, all in different countries. And every time you look at those maps, you see the same name. Now, here's the really crazy part. By the late 19th century, it was all gone. Now, don't get me wrong, the land, it was still there. But the name, that's what is gone. It's all been broken apart into regions like Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, Manchuria, and territories controlled by China and Russia. If you ask the historians, they'll say that the natural explanation is natural map making. They say that European map makers used one loose name and they used it for a huge region filled with different peoples, different nations, and different languages. The historians say that as the map makers' knowledge improved, they say that that label it became useless. Now, if you think about it, if that's really true, if they named all these countries that they've never seen or never heard of Tartary something or another, then they'd have called everywhere that they didn't quite understand Tartary. Yeah, I don't know. That's just a thought. I could be wrong. But there's people inside the rabbit hole that they ask a completely different question. If Tartary was a vague name for land that Europeans barely knew, why did map makers call it a kingdom? And why did you have encyclopedias describe it as a country? And why did versions of the name survive for centuries, all before disappearing from common memory? To them, the maps, they don't show geography becoming more accurate. They show an empire being divided, renamed, and erased. And if all that's true, then you have to ask, why did they do that? And why in the hell did they try to erase it from our memories? Then you have the theorists that point to a document from a place that knows a little bit about keeping secrets. And they also know a lot about rewriting the past. In 1957, the CIA it produced a report. And in that report were discussions about Soviet historical policy. Buried deep in that report is a reference to a 1944 order, and that order was calling for a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria. Now, I understand that that document does not say that Stalin covered up a global civilization. The normal reading is that Soviet officials were controlling how the region of Tartar and the history of Tartar was going to be taught, which is exactly the kind of thing that Stalin's government did. But that phrase, it's real. Revision of the history of Tartaria. Now, if you put those words in someone who that already suspects that Tartaria was removed from the record, and honestly, you don't have to tell them what to think. The document it becomes confirmation that history was deliberately changed. But look, here's the really uncomfortable part about all this. Governments, they really do rewrite history. They rename conquered land, they burn records, they tear down monuments, they turn enemies into villains and villains into heroes. And they put whole cultures into one paragraph. And that paragraph is written by people who defeated them. That's nothing new. So honestly, why would something like this be so hard to believe? Now, look, I understand that that does not prove that the Tartarian Empire existed, but it makes the question harder to laugh away because the maps they show the name, and some would even say that you could still see proof of their existence. You just have to look hard enough. On May 1st of 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition it opened in Chicago, and they called it the White City. It said that visitors were astonished when they walked through a huge glowing city of domes, classic columns, statues, lagoons, bridges, and palaces. Now, the really cool part was at night, the whole place was lit up. And this was at a time when many Americans had never seen a whole city light up like that at dark. Now, another crazy thing is on opening day, they said they had more than 120,000 people show up. And for the next 6 months, they said they had 27 million people show up. And after that, within just a few months, most of it had been dismantled, removed, and destroyed. Now, the documented story says that architect Daniel Burnham, he oversaw all the design. And you had a guy by the name of Frederick Olmsted that designed the grounds. Not only that, they said they had roughly 40,000 workers that helped build this expo. Now, how did they do it, you might ask? Well, they said that many of these grand building fronts they were built of something called staff. And staff is basically plaster and fiber that they just throw in front of like wood and steel. They can basically form it into anything that they want it to look like. And they wanted it to look like carved stone. And they did a really good job because it tricked a lot of people. But they said it was only designed to be temporary. Now, here's a big argument about this whole thing that the skeptics like to bring up. There was a budget, there was blueprints, there was payrolls and newspaper reports, and hundreds of construction photographs showing that all these buildings were being put up. So yes, there's an actual record of this thing being built. But then you look at the finished photographs, and honestly, I understand why people refuse to let this go. This wasn't some dinky looking row of carnival booths. It actually looked like a capital of an empire. You had the scale, the sculpture, and the waterways. And another thing is the detail would be almost impossible to reproduce today without spending billions and billions of dollars. And we're told to believe that they built it, they opened it, they welcomed the world inside, and then they tore almost all of it down. Now, look, Chicago, it wasn't the only place that they built one of these expos. In 1915, they did one there in San Francisco, and they called it the Panama Pacific International Expo. And they basically did the same thing. They covered the waterfront with another city of domes, towers, walkways, and huge courtyards. But the real attraction was sitting at the center of this whole thing, and they called it the Tower of Jewels. This thing was 435 feet tall, and it was covered with more than 100,000 pieces of cut glass. Now, they said the cost for all this was about $413,000 to build. And after the fair, it was sold to a demolition company for a measly $9,000. They said that all those jewels became souvenirs, and the tower, it came down. Now, according to official history, these fairs were just temporary fantasies. They were built quickly with cheaper materials because nobody expected for these buildings to stand there for long. But the Tartaria believers, they turned that story completely around. They say that the fair were staged explanations for cities that were already there. Then they said that the new population was invited inside. Not only that, they were told who had supposedly designed the buildings. And the buildings were presented as temporary so nobody would question anybody demolishing them. Then they said the old world structures were dismantled before anybody could question where these buildings really came from. Now, in that version of the story, the World's Fairs, they were not celebrations of progress. There were open houses held before the evidence was all destroyed. Now, all those photographs that they had of people putting those buildings up, that creates a serious problem for the claim that nobody built that white city in 1893. We should say that plainly. But those records, they do not answer the emotional question that's underneath this theory. Why were people more than 130 years ago willing to build temporary cities? And those cities were more beautiful than the permanent cities that we live in today. And why did we destroy so much of what was left behind? Places like Old Penn Station, the Singer Building, the Grand Theater, then you had hotels, courthouses, train depots, and all of this was demolished for office towers, highways, concrete boxes, and huge parking lots. Honestly, you don't need Tartaria to prove that we have been careless with our inheritance. But Tartaria, it gives that loss a different meaning. Now, let's go ahead and get into another theory that Tartarian believers they talk about a lot. They say that once you know what to look for, you start seeing it everywhere. You have windows that are cut in half by sidewalks, doorways that open below street level, and decorative arches that disappear right into the ground. They said that there's entire lower floors that's built right below modern cities. To most of us, we consider them basements. But to Tartaria believers, they're actually the old ground floor. Now, the theory says that sometime between the 18th and the 19th century, a massive catastrophe had buried cities in mud, silt, and debris. The date changes, and so does the cause. Some blame a comet, Others point to volcanoes, a pole shift, an electrical event, a worldwide flood, or a weapon that was used against Tartaria. Whatever caused it, believers say that the result was all the same. The old world vanished beneath a new layer of ground. The upper stories, they remain usable. So, whoever came afterwards, they bricked up the buried doors, converted the lower floors into basements, then they laid new streets across the mud, and they kept living in the shell of the older city. Now, I know all of that sounds wild until someone starts showing you all the photographs. You got a row of windows below a sidewalk there in Russia. Then you have a grand entrance reached by stairs leading down and not up. And you got workers opening up a street and exposing old arches and storefronts right underneath it. But look, one picture, I understand it proves nothing. But 100 pictures, that feels like a pattern. And the strongest part of the mud flood rabbit hole is that cities, they really are buried under cities. Now, look, Chicago, it might be our best example. In the late 1850s, central Chicago, it sat barely above Lake Michigan on flat, wet ground. They said sewage, it wouldn't drain properly. Streets, they turned into mud, and diseases like cholera spread through the city. So, engineers, they decided to do something about it. They decided they were going to lift Chicago. They started by adding fill beneath roads and sidewalks. Then they raised the buildings to meet the new street level. Now, this one's really crazy. In one operation, you had a full block, and on this block, you had 4 and 5 story buildings. Hell, some of these buildings, they weighed an estimate of over 35,000 tons. And they decided they wanted to lift this whole block 4 feet and 8 inches. And they did all this by using 6,000 jack screws. Now, I understand these jack screws, they don't work themselves. They used 600 men to screw these things all in unison. But here's the really crazy part about this. I know that's all crazy, but listen to this. Businesses, they stayed open while those men were under them working, while they raised the entire block. Now, another good example is Seattle. They rebuilt streets above older levels, and they did all this after the Great Fire of 1889. Then you had Sacramento that raised parts of downtown to survive flooding. You had utility tunnels, subway construction, new roads, and layers of rebuilding. They've all created underground districts in cities all across the world. Now, those histories, they explain many of those photographs that I showed you earlier. But I want you to think about what that explanation still asks you to accept. Human beings really did lift 35,000 tons of occupied buildings, and they did all this with hand operated screws while people still continued to shop right above them. To me, sometimes documented history, it sounds almost as impossible as the conspiracies do. And that's exactly why this theory survives. The observation is real. There are buried floors, there's sealed entrances, and there's cities beneath cities. But the whole disagreement is over what actually buried them. One person sees a century of construction, another sees a high watermark of a forgotten apocalypse. But understand this, the mud flood, it only explains how Tartaria fell. It doesn't explain why someone would need to erase it. For that, you have to look at what the believers said the buildings could actually do themselves. Now, you look at an old cathedral, and I understand you see a place of worship. But to a Tartaria believer, they may see a power station. The dome, it becomes an energy collector. The spire, it becomes an antenna. Then you have those metal finials that pull electricity from the atmosphere. Then you have the water that's beneath it that carries the charge. And not only that, the shape of the structure, it moves energy between the rooms. This collection of ideas is often called antiquitech. And that's basically technology from an older world, and it's hiding inside architecture that we were trained to see as just decoration. Believers, they point to the same features that appear across continents. You got copper domes, needle like spires, towers topped with metal ornaments. Then you got the huge pipe organs, the rose windows, and interior chambers built to precise proportions. In their version, these buildings were designed around frequency and resonance. The organs, they said, it did more than play music. Their sound, it moved through stone chambers and it was built to amplify vibration. Then you had the rose windows that resembled cymatic patterns. That's basically geometric shapes created when sound moves through physical matter. Not only that, they said that old hospitals, asylums, bathhouses, and cathedrals, they all may have used frequency for healing. Even certain forts became part of the pattern. They say from the air that these forts, they almost look too precise for military use. Now, you have conventional history that basically explains everything. They said that all these angles and points, they're used as defense against cannon fire. And they also allowed soldiers to cover the walls from different directions, and they basically removed blind spots. But inside the Tartaria story, all that geometry, it had another purpose. They said that star forts were nodes in the network, and they were possibly interacting with water, earth currents, or atmospheric electricity. Now, let's go ahead and talk about a guy by the name of Nikola Tesla. This is where he enters the rabbit hole. Tesla, he began building a place called Wardenclyffe Tower there in Long Island. His documented goal, he said, involved wireless communication. And not only that, he said he wanted to provide wireless electricity. Now, as you know, the tower, it never became operational. They said that funding collapsed and it was abandoned and demolished into scrap in 1917. And they claimed that it was to help settle Tesla's debt. Now, the believers of Tartaria, they look at Wardenclyffe and then they look at older towers, domes, and spires, and they ask whether Tesla was he inventing the future or was he just rediscovering the past? They argue that energy was once pulled from the environment and it was released through all this old architecture. There was no coal delivery, no power company, and no damn meter hanging on the side of your house. Now, that right there, that's the part of the theory that gives somebody motive. Because if Tartaria had buildings that could produce energy, they lasted for centuries, and they were possibly used to heal, then the civilization that replaced it would have a problem. Free energy, it can't be sold back to you every month. And a building that can last 500 years cannot be replaced every 50. And another thing, a population that remembers another way of living, they would be harder to control than one convinced that the current system is the best that we can do. Now, according to the theory, the old technology, it all had to be stripped away. Domes and spires became decoration, energy buildings became churches and courthouses, and working machines became mysterious antiques. And the people who remembered how to use them, they all had to disappear. And that brings us to the darkest part of this entire Tartaria story. If the old population was gone, where in the heck did the new ones come from? Okay, guys, this is the part of the story where I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't talk about this, but I really wouldn't be doing this story justice if I didn't mention this belief. Between 1854 and 1929, there was roughly 200,000 children, and they were all transported from crowded eastern cities to foster homes all across the United States. They became known as the orphan train children. Some had lost their parents to disease, some came from really poor families, and some came from parents that were riddled with addiction and abusive homes. But many weren't, they weren't technically orphans at all. Their parents were alive, but they were unable or sometimes unwilling to care for them. And to solve this problem, they thought it would be best to put these children on trains and head them out west. And at each stop, local families could inspect them and decide whether they wanted to take them home, almost like they were looking at pound puppies or something. And just like pound puppies, some children, they found love and stability, but others, they were treated horribly. Brothers and sisters, they were separated, names were changed, and family histories, they ended right there on a train platform. Now, understand that history, it's documented, and honestly, it's heartbreaking without adding a single conspiracy to it. But Tartaria believers, they see something else in those trains. They honestly see what they call a repopulation program. According to the reset theory, the catastrophe, they left Old World City standing, but they emptied them of most of the people. They said that the surviving adults were imprisoned or scattered, and the children that were too young to remember what came before, they were all gathered into institutions, assigned to new identities, and placed with families that were loyal to the replacement society. And within one generation, the children, they would grow up believing in one official story, and they would teach their own children that same history. Now, here's another part that became part of the story. I know you've seen these photographs. There's really old photographs of city landscapes where there's not a lot of people. Matter of fact, it almost looks like a ghost town. There's not a lot of people standing in these photographs at all. And believers would point to that and claim that that was part of that reset theory. They said in a lot of these photos, they'd only see a few blurred figures, and this was inside a city built for hundreds of thousands of people. Now, photography, it gives us a real explanation for a lot of those images. They claim that early exposures were slow enough that moving people could actually disappear from the frame. And a lot of photographers said that they would always like to choose quieter times so they could actually control what they shot, or they have some kind of control over what they shot. And that's basically the same way they do it now. But inside the reset theory, those photographs, they're not quiet streets. They are the morning after. They claim that the city survived, but the people, they didn't. And they claim that fires, wars, and demolition that supposedly finished what the catastrophe it started. They claim that records were burned, old technology disappeared, buildings that revealed too much they were torn down, then governments claimed the remaining structures and they attached new construction dates to them. Now, honestly, I didn't think it'd get bigger, but it does. The theory it gets bigger from here. They claim that prisons and asylums were places that a lot of the survivors were contained. And then they said that mass immigration was another way that they repopulated a lot of these areas. And then they claimed that the First and Second World War, that was controlled demolition on a world stage. And not only that, changes to calendars and changes to historical dates, they became part of the cover up as well. Now, to me, this is where the Tartaria rabbit hole, it can swallow damn near every event in modern history. And I want to stop for a second. I want to be honest about something. The orphan train movement, it has extensive records. They have disease, poverty, immigration, industrialization, and overcrowded cities that explain why so many children needed new homes. There's no established evidence that those trains repopulated America after some worldwide mud flood. But honestly, I understand why this part of the story it hits people really hard. 200,000 children, they were really separated from lives that they knew and they were sent into new homes. And old cities, they really do look empty in certain photographs. Then beautiful buildings, they really were demolished. And not only that, governments, they really have changed names, borders, records, and identities. The theory, it doesn't invent that. All it does is it takes them out of their separate boxes and it turns them into one story. A buried world, an empty city, a train filled with children who can't remember where they came from, and a new society moving into ruins. To me, that story feels ancient, almost biblical. Okay, guys, here's where I land after going through this rabbit hole. I can't tell you that there's a worldwide civilization and they're pulling free electricity through cathedral domes. And I can't tell you that a mud flood buried every major city 200 years ago. And I dang sure can't tell you that an orphan train were carrying 200,000 children of a murdered empire. The evidence, it doesn't give me the right to call those things facts. But I'm also not going to stand here and pretend that there's not nothing to look at. The maps are real, the old name is real, the buried floors are real, and the underground cities are real. And sadly, those orphan trains, they're real as well. The argument isn't about whether those things are real or not. The argument is actually over the thread that people use to put them together. Maybe Tartary was exactly what historians say it was, just a broad European label for vast lands, and it was used for people that they just didn't understand. And maybe the modern theory it grew because the internet it placed thousands of unrelated photographs. They placed them beside one another and they gave them one single name. All of that's possible. But let me tell you why I think the story survives. And I'll be honest, I understand this because powerful people, they've lied. Governments, they've erased cultures. Victors, they have changed records. Corporations, they've buried ideas that basically threaten profit. Cities, they've destroyed their own masterpieces. And then they replace them with buildings that nobody will mourn once they're gone. But here's the thing none of that stuff proves Tartaria. but it does explain why people believe that something like that is possible. And honestly, I think there's something else beneath this whole theory. I think there's grief. People, they look at those old buildings and they feel like something was taken from them. The craftsmanship, it feels impossible because we no longer value the time that's required to rebuild it. And the architecture, it feels like technology because modern buildings, they rarely make us feel anything at all. The idea of free energy, it does sound believable, but it seems so far away because every part of modern life, it comes with somebody's hands in our damn pockets, and they're not making a deposit, they're withdrawing. Tartaria, it takes all of that loss and gives it a villain. It says that the beautiful world, it was not abandoned, it was actually stolen. It said that human beings did not slowly choose cheaper buildings or disposable products or cities designed around traffic and profit. It's true. I do believe that somebody reset the world, and they're doing their damnedest to make us forget that there was ever another way to live. To me, that is true. So, the next time you pass an old courthouse, or a cathedral, or a train station, I promise you're going to look at it a little differently. You may see 19th century craftsmanship, or you may see the bones of a civilization whose name used to be printed across a lot of maps. And they're just there waiting for someone to remember what it meant. And honestly, that's the part I can't shake. Because if Tartaria had truly vanished, the greatest trick, it would not have been destroying an entire empire. It would have been leaving its world standing all around us and convincing us that there was never, ever anything there for us to find. Okay, guys, that's where I'm going to leave you tonight. I want to thank you so much for sticking around. I'd really like to know where you stand on all this. Was Tartaria just an old name on a bunch of old maps? Or do the maps, the buried buildings, the empty photographs, the lost technology, and those poor orphans point to something much bigger? I want you to tell me in the comments. And also, there's a part in this episode that I was really thinking about doing a full episode on, and that's Nikola Tesla. So let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a whole episode on that dude. Now, if this was your kind of mystery, all you have to do is hit the subscribe button, pound down on the like button, and share this episode with a friend who loves a good deep dive. Also, if you have a paranormal confession that you'd like to share with me, something that you can't explain, anything paranormal, anything like that, all you have to do is email me at relativeperspective76 at gmail.com, or you can visit my website, new website, at relativeperspectivemedia.com. All you have to do is scroll down a little bit. There's a place where you put your name, your email, and you could share your story with me. I promise I'm the only one that will see it. And if you allow me to share your story, we can do it a number of ways. I can either tell your story myself, or we can do a video interview or an audio interview, and I can keep you anonymous, or I can share your name, whatever you would like. We'll do it any way you'd like. Again, I want to thank you for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me. It means the world. As always, I'm your host, Stephen, and I'd like you to remember your truth depends on where you're standing. And that, my friends, is relative perspective. God bless you. We love you. Have a good night. Whew, Tartaria, huh? I don't know. There you go, Emily. I did Tartaria for you. Hope you liked it. Bye. Come on, Rosie. Let's go outside.